Okay, so why an introduction? Why not just delve right into the parallels? Well, because after observing many responses from antagonists to certain viral films out there on the internet, it seems to me that much of this backlash comes from the way this particular film painted its portraits of these pagan gods alongside the Christian Christ. By stating broad generalizations and employing an extremely liberal usage of what our society considers to be exclusively Christian terminology, it is, in my opinion, setting up the uninformed viewers, which sadly is most of them, it is setting up the uninformed viewers for somewhat of a disappointment. To give an example of what I mean, to assert that an Egyptian deity was crucified is naturally, for most Christians, going to invoke mental imagery of something like this. Or perhaps something like this. But, of course, no such image exists in ancient Egyptian artwork, nor is described, per se, in any of their texts. Now, I for one am familiar with what motif they are probably referring to. I am aware of a particular Egyptian motif that strongly parallels the crucifixion of Christ, which I will cover in a future video. But I would have reservations about referring to this motif explicitly as a crucifixion. Now, technically speaking, it would be a crucifixion, given how the terms translated as crucifixion in English were used by the ancient sources. But, given the meaning of the word crucifixion in today's society, which now comes with strong Christian connotations, to use the word as liberally as the ancient writers did, well, that is a bit unfair, because for the average person the word will invoke very specific imagery and not imagery of something that they are unfamiliar with, such as Egyptian mythology. So then, when they go and do their little half-ass research to verify, or rather to, quote, debunk, the claims of this film, and they do not find imagery like this, they dismiss the claim as bunk and uncredible, and so their research stops, and they never come across what it is that the film is actually referring to. So it seems to me that the more fair approach is to give them the layout of the story first, and then go in depth with the specific details and demonstrate how that evolved into motifs in Christianity, rather than tell them, hey, so-and-so was crucified, and then have them go and read the story itself only to be blinded by their firm expectation to see this and only this. Same with explanations of any evolution, like biological evolution. Just saying humans came from monkeys is a broad oversimplification and is somewhat misleading because of the mental imagery it will invoke for someone who is uneducated in such matters. And so, we shall give a brief synopsis of the mainstream version of the myth of Osiris, so to speak. I say this because there are many variations of the myth of Osiris, since the myth extends across 3 millennia and several territories around the Mediterranean. So, for the myth to branch off into local variations, or to simply change and be added to over time, is inevitable. But, nonetheless, there still remains a somewhat consistent skeleton lying underneath the flesh of all these variations. Not at all unlike Christianity, which across the millennia has produced innumerable variations of the Christ myth, and not just recently either, and not just since the Protestant Reformation. From its very beginning, Christianity has had many different denominations, all with their own variations on certain aspects of the myth. As renowned scholar Bart Ehrman has put it, quote, there were competing groups within early Christianity. These different groups held different sets of beliefs and practices, and they were all seeking to win converts to their perspectives. These beliefs and practices differed so widely from one group to another that historians have sometimes had difficulty acknowledging all of them as Christian. In the early centuries, of course, there were Christians who believed in only one God, but others claimed that there were 2 gods, the Marcionites, yet others said there were 30 gods, or 365 gods, various groups of Gnostics. There were Christians who maintained that this world was the creation of the one true God. Others said that it was the creation of the just but wrathful God of the Jews, who was not the true God. Others said it was the creation of much inferior ignorant deities who were malicious and evil. There were Christians who believed that Jesus was both human and divine. Others said he was human but not divine. Others that he was divine but not human. Others that he was two beings, one divine and one human. There were Christians who believed that Jesus' death was what brought about a restored relationship with God. Others said that Jesus' death had nothing to do with salvation, yet others said that Jesus never died. How could all these groups call themselves Christian? In fact, all of them insisted not only that they were Christian, but that they were the true Christians, and that all the other groups had misunderstood the teachings of both Jesus and his apostles, and each group had books to prove its point, books allegedly written by apostles that supported its various theological views. No one could simply turn to the New Testament to see which group was right. The New Testament didn't exist yet." End quote. And even today we have variations which believe Jesus was God, Jesus was just a demigod, Jesus was just a prophet, Jesus was just a man, Jesus was an angel, Jesus was born of a virgin, Jesus was born of sexual intercourse, Jesus was reincarnated, Jesus will come again in the future, Jesus already came in the past, the soul is immortal, the soul is not immortal, hell is eternal, hell is not eternal, eating meat is okay, eating meat is not okay, Sunday is the Sabbath, Saturday is the Sabbath, baptism of the Holy Spirit gives supernatural abilities, baptism of the Holy Spirit does not grant such abilities anymore, and so forth and so on, etc. Nonetheless, just as with the variations of the Osiris myth, the Christ myth variations all likewise have the same general theme, the same common thread running through all their variations, tying them together. Now, the most complete single narrative of the story of Osiris from an ancient work is generally acknowledged to be the one found in Plutarch's Moralia. But a couple of concerns, as is relevant to this series, is that Plutarch is rather late. His travels in Egypt occurred in the latter half of the 1st century, and he wrote them down at around the turn of the century or early 2nd century. So his writings are not exactly pre-Christian. He is, however, contemporaneous with the development of early Christianity, and he was a contemporary with many of the historians who were cited to support the historicity of the New Testament Christ. He was also a contemporary of the Apostolic Fathers. The other concern is that he also often departs from the general traditional narrative and goes off onto various Greek interpretations of the myths due to the heavy syncretism that had evolved up to that point. Nonetheless, we will more or less be following Plutarch's narrative in the Moralia as a general guideline, and see what is corroborative with pre-Christian Egyptian primary sources and whatnot. And much of what Plutarch writes can be verified by ancient sources, many of which are not only pre-Christian, but even pre-Old Testament. And as for the material which is unique to Plutarch, while it might be possible for one to argue that such material may not have existed before the 1st century, at the very least it definitely must have developed before Plutarch arrived in Egypt in the latter 1st century, and so at the very least the material would be contemporaneous with the origin and development of Christianity. Now, of course, this is highly unlikely, given the antiquity of the Egyptian mythology, and given that much of what Plutarch recorded is verified by older sources. Occam's razor would seem to point to the likelihood that the material unique to him most likely developed much earlier than the 1st century. But an argument for early 1st century origins, although unlikely, is perhaps somewhat justified. Anyway, so basically, Osiris was born the eldest son of Nut and Geb, goddess of the sky and god of the earth, who were in turn the children of Shu and Tefnut, god of air and goddess of moisture, who were in turn created by Atum, the eldest and self-created god of all the Ennead cosmology. I mention this so that you do not get confused if you come across the passages, like those in the pyramid texts, which speak of Geb and Shu and Atum as the father of Osiris, since it was common practice in ancient times to sometimes refer to all of your direct male ancestors as your fathers, or to refer to all of your descendants as your children. You see this in many instances throughout the Bible. And we find similar things in reference to extended family like nephews and cousins, etc., who are sometimes referred to as brothers. And it is a similar situation with mother figures as well. It was not uncommon for the royal and the wealthy to hire maids to nurse, wean, and even raise their children, an example of which can be seen in the story of Moses, in which the princess hired a Hebrew to nurse Moses, who, ironically, turned out to be his actual biological mother. Anyway, this was the case with Isis and Nephthys and so on. So the point is, don't let any of that confuse you. Another thing you must not let confuse you is, as I have pointed out in a previous video, the pyramid texts are funerary rituals for the purpose of making the dying pharaoh become one with Osiris, after having previously been Horus while he was alive. The pharaohs are often referred to explicitly as Osiris. So the vast majority of what is written in these texts concerning the pharaohs, the same is true of Osiris, such as the references to being the father of Horus or the son of Nut, etc. Now, getting back on track, Osiris has 3 siblings from Nut and Geb: Isis, who is also his wife, his brother Set, and Set's sister wife, Nephthys. As the oldest, Osiris was the king of Egypt. However, his little brother Set, being the next in line to inherit the throne, plotted the assassination of Osiris. He tricked Osiris into being locked into a chest, and then dumped the chest into the sea. Needless to say, Osiris died. His chest washed ashore, and a tamarisk or sycamore tree grew up around the chest and enveloped it. The tree was eventually discovered and carved into the famous Djed, or Tet, pick your flavor. Isis eventually discovered the location of Osiris's corpse and recovered it from the Djed, but Set soon found the body and tore it to pieces and scattered them throughout all the land. Isis and Nephthys went on a scavenger hunt for the pieces and managed to reassemble the body. They bound it together with linen, and so Osiris became the first mummy in Egyptian folklore. Sometime throughout the adventure, Isis somehow posthumously impregnated herself with Osiris's first child, Horus. Horus eventually raises Osiris from the dead, who then ascends, or descends depending on which era you're reading, to the realm of the gods. Horus does battle with Set to avenge his father. Osiris eventually passes judgment on Set, and so thereafter assumes the role of divine judge, while Horus assumes Osiris's previous role as the king of Egypt, from whence came the tradition that the living king of Egypt was Horus incarnate, the god in human form on earth, and when he died, the king became Osiris, and his son after him became the new Horus reigning on earth. Now, of course, many of you may be asking, how in the hell is that at all in any way similar to the story of Jesus? Well, on the surface, it may appear to have very little in common with that story. However, when you see the finer details of these motifs, and when you see how both of these stories were celebrated in ritual and depicted in visual imagery, it takes this to a whole other level. And that is the point of this series. And so, enough stalling, we shall now look into the motifs, beginning with their beginning.